колеги розпочинають.
And colleagues, we're starting our next press briefing, and again about the reforms, where we should start reforms in Ukraine to make them effective. And our speaker is Andrii, Kyrylenko, professor of practice of finance at MIT, Sloan School of Management. For some years, he has been leader in the top chart of the best universities of the world. Andrii, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you. Today I would like to express my opinion on where we should start reforms in Ukraine. And now I would like to first tell you about myself, my background, and why I am here. I would like to explain I started with this realm of Ukrainian problems relatively recently, when the Euromaidan exploded. Before that, I dealt with financial markets and such matters. 12 years I spent in IMF, and 4 years in the US government. After the financial crisis, I am a professor of finance at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. To use my IMF experience and the government experience to bridge the gap with the academic environment, faculty and students. So I had that experience of work with IMF and the government of the US. So I suggested to the government myself as an expert volunteer to help the government start working with IMF, explaining the constituents of that program and the assumptions of that program, because such programs are developed according to some standard models, and then they have to be made more flexible for them to become operational and useful for the country to first stabilize the economy and then start some economic rise. The first time I came to Ukraine in May, spent 3 to 4 weeks here. And I started with some briefings on my experience at the Ministry of Finance, the National Bank of Ukraine, but my impression was that we had to also build up an expert society which does not belong to the government, because the government is quite big and capable, and it's at the same time one of the causes of this economic situation. Too many people, too little performance. And we started building up that network of experts and expertise beyond the governmental circles for the society, not just the officials, to benefit. And that network started building itself up. Myself and other people contributed, professors, experts. Now I have joined another experts network, VoxUkraine portal, it's called, where you can make economic references. It's very special. And last time I suggested to them that we had to start the reforms from a certain reference point. I read the program of IMF after the first review of the program introduced for Ukraine and posted on the website back in September. And I looked on the program. If you know how to read it, because it's a tricky thing, lots of matrices and so on. The language is not plain English or plain anything. It is not always apprehensive, but as an expert, I looked into it, and in that program, as a big challenge, I identified something we have to start with. This is oil and gas sector in Ukraine. In terms of figures, the money that we have to put together to finance this in 2014 alone to service the debt, there's a past period, it's 118 billion hryvnias. The deficit of all the budget of all the country is 88 billion. For you to compare, so oil and gas sector in Ukraine, this is bigger than this is the state-run joint stock company, Naftogaz it's called. So you can have 55, 60 billion hryvnias, and that means that you need another financial system just to. We need two financial systems to fund Naftogaz alone. Not the country, not any sector or industry, just this Naftogaz Ukraine and National Joint Stock Company Naftogaz. So it's either Naftogaz when goes bust, or Ukraine has to do something with Naftogaz to restructure it, to do something. This is not a transparent system.
This is not very transparent structure. It's not clear what's in there. There are some physical assets, financial assets, some financial component. There are some liabilities and some guarantees of the government. And I also believed that this problem, even though no one is talking about that, and the risks related to it are probably not that big, but the problem is there. And the technical side of what to do with Naftogaz of Ukraine, the technical problem is there. The experts give many comments. Some expert group was doing some audit. You can find such information. And I have an impression that maybe we understand what to do at the technical level, at the level of the experts, but there's no political will to start this process. And so I suggest how this political process should be started. Maybe it's worth doing so that the politicians are not responsible for the final reform, but for the process, for the beginning of the reform and for the process of the reform. And then if the politicians are asked, what do you do with Naftogaz, they will say, yeah, the reform is going on, we do this or that. Maybe this way we can come out of that trap, of not doing anything, because the trap is big. All the society, all the population of Ukraine is somehow related to Naftogaz. If you use the gas stove, or if you need to have heating in your house, in your apartment, that is basically the problem which everyone in Ukraine can feel. And many were involved into resolving that problem. And that is why it comes up to this high political level. So that is why I believe that we, the society, we need somehow to join experts who know how to start it at the technical level, and we probably need to exercise pressure on the government, this government or next government, so that the problem starts to be resolved, so that we start from the reform of Naftogaz, because the risks are bigger than the risk of the related to budget, to financial system, and that limits now the fiscal policy, monetary policy, these structural problems, this structural distortion in Naftogaz limits the possibility to do something with other reforms. Also, I believe without the role of the expert community, without us, it will be difficult for just politicians to do something. We have to be involved. There should be some network of experts, of people who would work at a certain level to address the expert political component. So if you have any questions, please ask. I have a question. I understand you need to start reforms from the reform in the energy sector. You need to start from Naftogaz of Ukraine, the company. So basically the negotiations on gas between Ukraine, Russia and Europe ended up in nothing. There will be a new round of negotiations, but the perspectives are not very good. To come to an agreement with Russia, we understand that we have to agree to all their conditions. So how could you comment on what should be the correct policy of Ukraine towards Russia on gas negotiations to at least be able to survive this winter? And also, the state is implementing this policy and has the negotiations at the highest level, but what should the population do? Maybe we need to do a lot of awareness campaign for the population, especially for people in rural areas. Maybe they should use more timber. So all these negotiations on gas import, and that's what Naftogaz is doing. These negotiations are part of the problems. The problems have been accumulated for the last 23 years. And if we give a very positive big signal to the world community that we will start addressing these problems radically, then after such a signal, we will be able to involve international organizations, international community into negotiations to change the balance of forces. I believe that this will be bad if Ukraine does something unilaterally. We need to involve EU or the IMF or either the European Union or the IMF, because now the IMF is the only external creditor of Ukraine. So the IMF has to be involved into these negotiations. The European Union We have agreement with the European Union on the third gas package. They are involved. But we need to address some current issues. But also we need to be ready to large structural changes. Maybe that will change the balance of forces. Then the international partners may take it as a positive signal, because between Ukraine and Russia, as you understand, Russia has gas and Ukraine doesn't have gas. So what sort of negotiations are these? But Hungary, for example, refused in providing reverse. So besides having negotiations with Russia, we need to have negotiations with Europe. Europe is to be involved, but it's not like give us the chance to survive. Maybe we need to give a signal that we are implementing the reform, and now the time has come that we will conduct some big structural reforms. This creates a different foundation for negotiations. Because when negotiations are conducted, everyone thinks when will be the next round of negotiations, because this way we do not address the structural problems. The next negotiations will take place in 2 weeks or 3 months. And if we can show that we are starting the structural reforms, then this may change the balance. Another question. I have 2 questions to you. One is a continuation of your statement. What should Ukraine do during the negotiations to push the European Union and the IMF to more decisive steps? Reforms is a very general thing. Even if we start them tomorrow, the results we will not see quickly. And the second question, it's about the program of energy efficiency. We need media support, we understand, but certain actions on energy efficiency require, again, investing some money, but we will see the results in the future, and that's not cheap. So what should be the principles of the support for the population? Maybe we need to attract some credit resource. There were certain attempts in Lutsk, they were trying to do something. So what should be the specific steps? Thank you. Answering your first question. That is what I was saying. We need to start from something, and maybe we need to start reforms from something structural. What is the most important? We need to say, for example, we will restructure Naftogaz. What can it mean? The corporate structure will be restructured. There will be some restructuring of financial assets made, the restructuring of some physical assets will be made. There will be a single market created for gas prices, so that there is one price for gas. And if this price corresponds to what the gas costs, then companies, physical persons will know how to restructure their needs. From
населенням.
From the point of view of our work with the population, the more transparent, the better. The more directives, the better, if you ask me, because now it's practically cross-funding of the population through the budget, and the budget partially funds the artificially lowered tariff for the households. That's the state debt. Perhaps we should do a different thing. And it's also opaque because for a specific consumer, it's not clear what's the sovereign debt and how this correlates with one's consumption of natural gas at the household. If we make this more direct and specific, then we'll have direct incentives for the consumers, for the end users at different level to solve the problem of their reorientation with the same price, and direct transferred for the people who cannot afford the price, and somebody will be taxed, somebody will be subsidized, depending. And great pressure from the point of view, from the part of those who are controlling the financial flows, cash flows. It's going to be painful. And we also understand that reforms, by and large, reforms of energy sector won't make everybody better. Somebody will feel better, somebody will not. It's not symmetric. We should not expect this reform to make everybody happy. Somebody will suffer from it. Somebody will have to pay more while they are not paying at all or pay very little currently. Another question. You're a professor of finance, so I would like to ask a financial question. A lot of attention is given to currency and the exchange rate. What's the situation of the National Bank and its policy? Is it correct, and what should Ukraine expect from the exchange rate policy, and what will happen by the end of this year? Can you forecast? I think that National Bank of Ukraine are using means, instruments that they have at hand, that they have keep available for the situation when we have big structural problems that I mentioned earlier. So the exchange rate, is it the result of such structural problems? The exchange rate that we observe consists of several components. It consists of accumulation of the structural problems. We need dollars to repay the debts of naphtha gas, dollars taken from IMF and from reserves, provisions of the national banks, Bank of Ukraine. And there are no other imaginable sources. Moreover, it so happened, if we have such dollars and the economic situation is stabilized with some out or inner reserves or provision from the IMF vaults or any other source, and we have some stabilization of the balance sheet, experts mention input, then we can imagine some reasonable action. Now input exceeds export even at this exchange rate. So the balance sheet is not equalized yet. We have to look for dollars not just to repay the debts of Naftogaz, but also this balance between export and import in favor of import. And there are negative expectations also worsening the situation, whether Naftogaz will not afford it, or IMF will decide that Ukraine has to be left on its own. There are many negative points that coincide with the objective processes. The structural tilts and distortions, the war, shut down enterprises in the ATO area. There's no influx of dollar, the war, structural problems, negative expectations. So now, in my opinion, we cannot clearly see how to place this exchange rate, but it's a negative trap anyway for the country, because such negative expectations lead to the situation when we have some outflow of capital from the banking system. People want to convert this into dollars, and this provides for the deficit of the balance sheet, and this is one of the saving opportunity. You can buy something to use your money properly to retain the value, and it's all mutual. This negative situation should be somehow changed or controlled. So the means used by the National Bank of Ukraine are used as ad hoc measures, temporary measures to avoid falling into that trap head and shoulders, to prevent that drain of deposits. So we do not clearly see where the realistic exchange rate should be. The fundamental one can be higher than the commercial one, because there are many negative expectations influencing that, and if such negative expectations are curbed somehow, then we can deter the rise, and the exchange rate will be equalized somehow. Maybe I cannot satisfy you with my answer, but I think that the National Bank are using means of administrative regulation, and they say that they want to support the market, they have to support the market, but if you have before you such negative expectations, then negative expectations are not so easily managed. So we are going to have them, and they're going to persist. With the most optimistic scenario, we're going to have this war, and the reforms are not active enough for the weak economy. Yes, we have to do something to compensate for the volatility of that exchange rate. It's also a problem because this is the only figure. It's like a gas tariff, another figure, and each person in Ukraine knows this figure. So the exchange rate is another thing that is known. So if you walk the streets, you'll see that figure everywhere, advertised practically, posted everywhere, and it is there, and people work with it. It influences their behavior every day. And if this is historically so, then we have to do something, understanding that it influences our daily operations in that way. Negative expectations, they can be there, but people do not always translate that into some conduct. If they see this figure like a spell every day in every street, almost at every corner, such negative expectations may be translated into active action very soon. So we had that fixed figure for too long a time, and now it is gone. Another question. Professor, investments from FDIs, what's their status in Ukraine right now? And how, what's the word? How do our reforms do in terms of that there's corruption in IFT, so the reforms are not that advanced.
I will try to answer what I believe your question was about. If I say something different, just correct me. I believe that now the only strategic investor of Ukraine is the International Monetary Fund. In Ukraine, you know what is the situation of Ukraine now. That is called the country loses access to the international capital markets. There's no direct access. There is some strategic investor with who you can work. But historically, even when some investors feel that the macro financial situation will be stabilized thanks to the program of the IMF, they start coming and looking at the opportunities. They believe that Ukraine will soon have the access to the international capital markets, and that is a very competitive time. This is very good time to start doing something with this country. So very quickly after macroeconomic stabilization, the country doesn't have immediate access, but in some time the process starts when the country starts having some access to the international markets. And what is most important for the country to do in this period of time is to implement reforms, being in the program of the IMF, because that is a strategic investor. And so if there is a review of the program, if you pass this test every time, you have to pass this test. And every time when you do that, the investors understand, okay, they had the test and they have passed it. Then there's the next test and they passed it and you can work with them. And one more small question. The International Monetary Fund has the right to cancel relations with us unilaterally if they do not see that we are combating corruption. So we have corruption. Then let the IMF close that, and we have taken something. The program with the IMF, the programs are developed so that the country goes to the IMF and makes a request for some program, for some money, and writes what the country has to do. Anti-corruption component of that program is there in the program, and if I understand it correctly, the IMF and other international financial and non-financial organizations, they also send the technical assistance missions, and such missions also help understand not just that we need to fight corruption, but how, using international experience, how to overcome some corruption problems. Unfortunately, we don't have time left for questions, but I would like to ask one more question now. People talk about the effect of the sanctions imposed against Russia by the US and Europe. And if the sanctions do not affect Russia, because Russia can feel could feel fine previously, but now Russia can start feeling the sanctions. So could you comment? How will the sanctions affect Russian economy? How do they affect now, and how will they affect in the future? I believe that the sanctions will have an effect. Maybe for some time it will not be clear how they affect. The information that comes from Russia we will not understand whether the information coming from Russia is truthful or not, because they may pretend that the sanctions do not have any effect. But in general, we can say that the sanctions are cumulative. It is difficult to see them for some time. They are not linear. It seems that nothing happens, but then some moment comes and it breaks. They get accumulated inside, and then everything collapses. So we need to look at how the sanctions affect, not like every day, but we need to follow some external indicators which will help understand what's happening. If the capital starts going outside of the country quickly, that will mean that someone understands that it will get collapsed and they need to take money out. If you see that parents send their children away from the country, so there will be such non-direct indicators. So just look at these indicators. Thank you. That was Andrii Kyrylenko, professor of the practice of finance at the MIT.